You're watching PM Agenda. Good to have you with us. As we mentioned earlier, Labor and the Greens separately have identified more specifically which budget measures they're going to support and oppose. The one the Greens were weighing up was the plan of the government to re-index fuel excise so that it goes up and up twice a year from now on. It has been frozen since 2001, in fact, 38 cents a litre. In the end, the Greens have decided not to support this. So they do not support returning to indexation of fuel excise. Tell us about this decision and some other matters of the day. The Greens leader Christine Milne joins me now. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, David.
Let me start with this principal question. Do higher petrol prices reduce petrol use?
Not if you put all the money into new freeways, East-West Link, West Connects. You actually get more congestion, more cars, worse city planning and greenhouse gas increases in the longer term.
Hang on,
so it doesn't make sense.
The logic underpinning this is pretty important. So you don't think necessarily that a higher petrol price does reduce petrol use?
It will if you have alternatives, if you have public transport in place and if you have more fuel efficient vehicles and if you have the appropriate planning. But the point here is Tony Abbott was never doing this as transformative to get to a low carbon economy. He's doing it purely as revenue raising, and the revenue is to build more freeways and more freeways to add more congestion and more greenhouse gases. That doesn't make sense.
Well, sure, but if I live in a street where there is a bus and a train station down the road, my petrol price goes up. I am more likely to use the public transport, aren't I?
You might, but the overwhelming majority of people, and particularly poorer people, live further from the centre of the cities. They have less access or no access in many cases to public transport, and right around the country that's the case, and they drive often the oldest vehicles. So what we've said is if you had a framework in place about reducing greenhouse gases and transport was part of it and the money was going into public transport, that is a different thing. But this is actually going to be giving Tony Abbott the money to build the East-West Link, to build the West Connects, all the things we do not support, and to increase emissions. That doesn't make sense.
Look, it's true a lot of people don't have public transport options, but a lot of people do, and that's the point I'm making. You increase petrol price for them, that is going to turn them away from using petrol, isn't it?
Well, it depends. What you see with more freeways is you get more people actually using them. You get greater congestion on other roads, and that's what we're going to see here. What we want to make sure is that we see more investment in public transport, and instead of that, the Abbott government has dropped all of the proposals for public transport, whether it was the urban rail in Perth, the Melbourne Metro, there was one for Brisbane as well, right around the country, dropped all those. There's nothing there for high-speed rail, nothing for those kinds of projects. Everything to facilitate a road agenda.
They were never going to. They made that clear prior to the election. They weren't going to. That had nothing to do with the fuel excise decision. The position you were articulating before today's party room meeting was that you would be prepared to negotiate with the government on those demands to put the money into public transport. Coming out of the party room meeting, though, you're no longer willing to negotiate with the government?
Well, Joe Hockey made it very clear early in May that he wasn't going to negotiate at all. He said it was all or nothing. They made it clear in the budget this was about putting all of the money into roads, and it was also about giving the increased indexation back to the big miners. Now that means giving a greater percentage of the budget back to Gina Rinehart and co,
sure, but
and that makes no sense.
You can try to negotiate here because the government has also said, I know they've said that, but they've also said they'll take a responsible approach with the Senate, work with the Parliament they have. You could move an amendment to this.
Why would I want to facilitate the East-West Link? Why would I want to facilitate roads from one end of Australia to the other, billions more dollars, into more congestion, more greenhouse gases?
But can't you move an amendment to say you're not going to support hypothecating this money into those road projects?
Well, it wouldn't matter because they're still spending them on roads anyway. The fund itself is only a percentage of what they were going to put into roads. This is about Tony Abbott raising the money to build pork-barrelled roads from one end of the country to the other to increase greenhouse gas emissions.
That's what you could seek to amend, couldn't you, in the Senate?
There's no way that we can prevent a government spending the money on roads if it chooses to do so. What is clear here is we are not going to put the money into greater congestion, more roads, more greenhouse gases. What we want to see is maintaining the carbon price. We want to see an end to the subsidy going back to the big miners, not an increase in it, and we want to see investment in public transport.
But it seems you've hardened that position on negotiation Were you rolled in the party room on this?
No, not at all. In fact, this is a position that I have come to very strongly. You know I'm passionate about global warming. If I seriously thought we could get a policy position which would reduce greenhouse gases, I would be involved in trying to do that. But what this is, contrary to what he told President Obama, incredibly, that the excise in Australia was a carbon price, far from that. Why haven't we got Tony Abbott max the tax here in Australia? We haven't. It's all about revenue raising for roads, and we are not going to build that east-west link.
Let me turn to the case of Peter Grester. Do you believe Australia should be imposing sanctions against Egypt after this sentence?
Yes, I do. I think the court case has demonstrated that there is no independence from the government of the legal system in Egypt. It's been a farce throughout. The prosecution case was ludicrous. Any lawyer would say that. Of course, they'll have to go through the appeal process, but why would you think the appeal process was going to be any more fair or legitimate than the case?
Well, it would seem one of the best chances of him returning home would be through a presidential pardon.
Absolutely.
How are sanctions going to help convince the president to pardon Peter Grester?
Well, the approaches have been made to him to pardon Peter Grester up until now, and nothing has happened.
Well, they haven't been made to pardon him because he wasn't sentenced.
People had hoped that the position that happened of those journalists was because it was the lead up to the election. People hoped that after the election, when President El-Sisi had been elected, that he would then change his position, and that hasn't happened. What we can do now is say to Egypt, this isn't satisfactory. We do not accept journalists being arrested and jailed for 7 years for doing their job. And we put sanctions on the table, and the first of those I would suggest would be travel bans. That's one that is quite common to be used. It would send a clear
but again,
message.
if you put travel bans on presumably the President and senior ministers, do you really think that's going to encourage him to pardon Peter Grester?
Well, what else is? There's going to have to be a show of strength for around the world, and I think we're going to see that the United States is going to ramp it up. The UK clearly is ramping it up. And this, I mean, Peter Grester's been charged with basically denigrating Egypt in the eyes of the world. Well, I'd say the legal system of Egypt denigrated that country in the eyes of the world, and we now have to stand up not only for Peter and his colleagues, but for journalists worldwide. Otherwise, every Australian journalist working anywhere on the planet is going to know that if they are jailed, their government's going to wring its hands and do nothing. Finally,
can I ask you about the decision of the UN World Heritage Committee rejecting the government's request to delist some 74,000 hectares of forest in Tasmania's World Heritage Area? The Prime Minister says the government's looking at considering its next move. Is there any way the government can overturn this, do you think?
No, there isn't. The World Heritage Committee described the Australian case as feeble. It was described as an unprecedented move, which indeed it is, and it was rejected out of hand. Australia has been humiliated on the world stage by the Prime Minister and by Senators Betts and Colbeck. Essentially, they were the drivers of it. It was always a domestic strategy to try and win seats in Tasmania, and it's embarrassed everyone. Now they have said they will abide by the decision of the World Heritage Committee. That means they give up any pretence that they're going to go in there and log. But secondly, the World Heritage Committee said whether they wanted the money on the table for the cultural assessment for Tasmania's Aboriginal people, and let's see that money spent. So this should be the end of a very shabby saga from Tony Abbott.
Greens leader Christine Milne, thank you.
Thank you.